Welcome to our final AbleCon session, an overview of supported decision-making. We're honored to be joined by Olivia Bavis-Keller, Senior Public Policy Analyst, and Caitlin Cliven, Director of Community and Healthcare Services at Disability Rights Florida. How are you doing, Olivia and Caitlin?
Good, thank you. Thanks for having us.
Wonderful. So a little background on our speakers. Caitlin's work is primarily focused on issues related to healthcare and community inclusion. As a social worker turned lawyer, Caitlin has spent her entire career in public service and has held several positions, professional and volunteer, advocating for and representing others. Olivia was born with a physical disability and has worked toward building a more equitable society for most of her life. She is currently the Senior Public Policy Analyst at Disability Rights Florida, and she was previously the peer mentor at the Suncoast Center for Independent Living, where she assisted others with disabilities to achieve independence to the greatest extent possible. Olivia and Caitlin, I'll now turn it to you guys to start your presentation. And we'll, of course, have time for questions at the end. Let me get my screen going. All right, you all should see the presentation.
Yes.
Okay, take it away.
Sure. So I will kick us off. As mentioned, my name is Olivia Bavis-Keller. I'm the Senior Public Policy Analyst at Disability Rights Florida. I am a middle-aged white woman with bright red hair, wearing black and clear glasses, with a black shirt with white polka dots, and my background is blurred. Today, we're going to be talking about supported decision-making. So just a little bit of background. Actually, yeah, we can go to the next slide. A little bit of background about Disability Rights Florida. Our mission is to advocate, educate, investigate, and litigate to protect and advance the rights, dignity, equal opportunities, self-determination, and choices for all people with disabilities. We were created by the DD Act, Developmental Disabilities Act, in response to abuses and exploitation and neglect of people with disabilities, primarily those with intellectual and developmental disabilities, in Willowbrook specifically, but in institutions across the country. We receive funding. We have responsibility and authority under 9 federal grants to protect the rights of Floridians with disabilities since 1987. So as I mentioned, we started with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and we've since expanded to really become a cross-disability organization, and we represent all people with disabilities who are residents of Florida. We have access authority to any agency, institution, and organization that serves or involves people with disabilities. And this is kind of a unique authority, unique power that the protection and advocacy organizations, of which Disability Rights Florida is Florida's protection and advocacy organization, and other agencies do not have this ability. So this is unique to the PNA network. Next slide. Just to go over our agenda for the presentation, we're going to kind of give a brief description and overview of supported decision-making. You'll hear us say SDM as an abbreviation for supported decision-making. You may hear us say SDMA, which stands for Supported Decision-Making Agreement, and kind of the history of where this started, an overview of current laws, the statutory and professional responsibility and duties relating to less restrictive alternatives to guardianship, when and when not to use supported decision-making. There are situations where this is an appropriate tool, other situations where this may not be appropriate for that individual. Talking about SDM as an alternative to guardianship, and also how it can be used in conjunction with the guardianship and other tools as well, and some examples of client scenarios, and then we'll jump into questions. So next slide. So what is supported decision-making? This is a process that we all use in our lives. It's a process of supporting adults with disabilities or cognitive impairments to make their own choices about their lives. And it places the individual with a disability at the center of the decision-making process. As I mentioned, this is a process we all use. Not everybody knows everything about everything. So if you are not a mechanic and your car is making a weird noise, you take it to a mechanic or a professional that can fix your car. SDM works in the same way. It is offering support and information and explaining things in a way in concrete, simple terms so people can understand and make appropriate, effective decisions in their own best interest. So that's kind of how this is used. Next slide. As I mentioned, this is something we all use in our everyday lives. It's just more formalized process for people with disabilities. You'll see these as legal documents used to really help people either terminate a guardianship or put them in a less restrictive guardianship as appropriate, or sometimes to keep people out of guardianship. So they have a formal agreement to show that they do have supporters that are assisting them. And supported decision-making is supported by the American Bar Association, the Administration for Community Living, the United Nations, the ARC, and lots of other disability organizations, as well as self-advocates. Next slide. Some of the key features of supported decision-making. So supporters help the decision maker understand the issues, options, responsibilities, and consequences of their decisions. They will help them ask questions, receive explanations that the decision maker can understand, and they help the decision maker communicate their decisions to others. The thing that is unique about supported decision making, that's a little different than other alternatives to guardianship, is that the decision-making authority stays with the individual with a disability. So unlike a power of attorney, where this is substitute decision-making or shared decision-making, where both the person that person is appointed as their agent under a power of attorney can make decisions on behalf of someone. With supported decision-making, they have no authority to take any actions or make any decisions on behalf of the decision maker or person with a disability. Next slide. So why do we need SDM? This is something that Disability Rights Florida has been fighting for the past 4 legislative sessions to get codified into state law, just to have it recognized in statute, to make sure that this is a tool that is being used, that judges and attorneys are informed and educated about it, to preserve rights of people with disabilities and with cognitive impairments. There are people who do need people to make decisions on their behalf, but oftentimes guardianship and guardian advocacy are overutilized, and supported decision-making is one of the tools that we can use to make sure people receive the support they need without losing rights to make decisions about their own lives. Supported decision-making can help prevent abuse. Oftentimes people under guardianship are isolated, sometimes from their own families. So if there is a situation where abuse or exploitation is taking place, there may not be anyone that they can contact to inform that they are experiencing this. So it really helps to prevent some of this abuse and exploitation. It is cost saving. So guardianship is very expensive. It can cost $10,000 to $15,000 for someone to establish a guardianship. They have to provide annual plans, there are fees associated with that. Supported decision-making agreements can be drafted by the decision maker themselves or with assistance from their intended supporters. And it doesn't have to go through the court system. So it really is a cost savings and also addresses some of the stress put on the court system as well. And it increases self-determination through practice. So a lot of times people with disabilities, particularly those born with disabilities, particularly specifically intellectual and developmental disabilities, have never really had the ability to make their own decisions. People in their lives have kind of always made those decisions for them. So it's not necessarily that they don't have the capacity to make their own decisions. They've just never had the opportunity to do so. So with the assistance of supporters, it increases that self-determination. They're making their own decisions. And the more they do that and they learn from, being allowed to make mistakes, and making their own decisions and facing the consequences of that, whether that be good or bad, it helps increase self-determination and they get better at decision-making through practice. So next slide. This is also leads to better employment and community integration. Typically people will have a number of supporters. So there's kind of a team that's really working with this individual. They can decide their own employment decisions. They don't need permission from anyone if they want to volunteer or if they want to be employed. And having that ability increases their confidence, it increases their independence, their happiness and their self-satisfaction with life. It makes them more active and accountable for mental and physical health decisions, and just generally improves the ability of people with disabilities to be able to identify abusive situations and know how to report those instances. Next slide. So the history of supported decision-making and where this started. So this originated in Sweden in 1988. In 1993, the first supported decision-making laws were implemented in British Columbia and Canada. So provinces in Canada have had supported decision-making for about 30 years now. In 2006, approval of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities recognized that supported decision-making was an alternative to guardianship, and really have stressed the importance of people being able to make their own decisions without restrictions placed on them, and really emphasized guardianship as a tool that should be used as a last resort only in very extreme circumstances where people absolutely do not have the ability to make their own decisions. And we've seen in response to this that a lot of members of the UN have either terminated their guardianship laws. Some of their court systems have deemed guardianship unconstitutional. And we are seeing them implement supported decision-making either in states or provinces similar to our states here, or even as national policy. Unfortunately, the United States, although we signed the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, it is something that the US has not yet ratified. But the countries that have ratified it have really been making very drastic reforms to their guardianship laws. In 2013, Virginia became the first state to order the use of supported decision-making in place of guardianship. Some people may have heard of Jenny Hatch. She was a young woman with Down syndrome who wanted to make her own decisions about where to live and where she wanted to be employed. She did not want to live with her family. Her family had guardianship over her and really wasn't respecting the decisions that she wanted to make in her life. And therefore, she was able to terminate her guardianship and use supported decision-making. In 2014, the founding of the National Resource Center for Supported Decision-Making, SDM, was founded. And in 2015, Texas was the first state to pass a supported decision-making law. In 2017, supported decision-making was included in the Uniform Guardianship, Conservatorship, and Other Protective Arrangements Act. So we're seeing more and more that supported decision-making has been utilized. We're seeing more state statutes. And so this is something that is increasing and growing across the country, but also internationally as well. Next slide. So there are currently 23 states, as well as the District of Columbia, that have all enacted supported decision-making statutes. And these include both what we consider conservative and liberal states. So we see, Texas, Louisiana, Alabama, but also Washington and California and New York and Maine have all implemented supported decision-making laws. When we started our efforts with trying to pass supported decision-making in Florida 4 years ago, there were only 11 states with supported decision-making laws. So that number has increased significantly to almost half of US states now having supported decision-making statutes. Next slide. So in Florida, the first known use of supported decision-making in Florida was in 2016 in St. Lucie County. We're going to get into that individual story, but he was able to have his guardianship terminated and a supported decision-making agreement put in place. So this, the less restrictive alternatives that currently exist in Florida statute are under 744.1012, which is the legislative intent, 744.331 in determining incapacity, and 744.2005 order of appointment. All of those are for guardianship, both plenary and limited guardianship. And then 393.12 covering capacity and the appointment of guardian advocate. And guardian advocacy tends to be the guardianship that is used most frequently for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Next slide. So in this last legislative session in Florida, the 2024 legislative session, supported decision-making finally passed. The bill number was HB 73. The Senate bill number was 446. So this passed the Florida legislature unanimously in this last session. It still needs to be signed by the governor, but it is set to go into effect July 1st, assuming the governor signs it. Or even if he doesn't sign it, as long as he doesn't veto it, and we receive no indication that that is something that is being considered. So the supported decision-making bill in Florida requires courts to consider the needs and abilities of a person with a disability when determining whether to appoint a guardian or a guardian advocate. It requires the petitions and court orders to identify and assess the sufficiency of guardianship alternatives such as SDM. So making sure that there isn't a tool that is not as restrictive as guardianship that would serve this person's interests better. It defines supported decision-making agreements in 709.2209, and it prohibits such agreements from acting as a durable power of attorney. So in Florida, we actually place supported decision-making under the power of attorney statute. So this is very much being looked at as kind of a limited power of attorney. So an agent, unlike a durable power of attorney, can't make decisions on behalf of that person. It's just giving them the ability to offer assistance, to collect information. But again, it is not a durable power of attorney. And the bill also establishes SDM agreements as a method by which students may provide informed consent to allow parents to access confidential educational records. So one of the things that we were seeing in Florida with students that can stay in the school system up to age 22, that schools were really encouraging guardianship. So teachers and other administrators at the school were informing parents that in order to stay involved in their child's education and to be able to access their education records, that they needed a guardianship, and that is not the case. The student can sign a supported decision-making agreement and designate, one of their parents as their supporter for making educational decisions, and that parent will then be able to access those confidential records, but not able to make decisions on behalf of that student. So I am going to toss it over to Caitlin to cover our next slide.
You, Olivia. I'm Caitlin Clippen. As Olivia said earlier, I am a middle-aged white woman with shoulder-length brown hair. I have a background behind me that's a fake background with orange and red and purple and the DRF logo. And it says advocacy, equality, and dignity. So I'm going to talk about some different aspects of SDM, but I did want to kind of go back to one of the things Olivia said a few moments ago when she was talking about the statutes. The legislative intent and all the places in our Florida statutes that talk about alternatives to guardianship, and those have been in place well before we were talking about SDM. So the state has already indicated a value on preserving rights and making sure that people's rights aren't removed unless it's absolutely necessary. So in line with that and with those state priorities, is our advocacy for supported decision making. But one of the concerns that can sometimes arise with attorneys like myself when working with clients is our relationship with our client who is a person with a disability, and whether we can serve them in this way or whether we have to call in someone else. So previously there were ethical rules in place that made attorneys believe that if they had any suspicion their client lacked capacity, that they couldn't allow their client to make any more decisions and they had to call in someone else. But those ethical rules were recently changed in the last few years to make it explicitly clear that lawyers are not required to seek a determination of incapacity or the appointment of a guardian, or to take any other protective action with respect to a client. They may, but they are not required to. What a lawyer must do is they must make reasonable efforts to exhaust all other available remedies to protect the client before seeking removal of any of the client's rights or seeking the appointment of a guardian. So in effect, what this does is kind of absolves the concern that your client might not be able to even have the capacity to engage with you. And then it also helps with issues of privilege. So, when a client is speaking to a lawyer, all their communications are privileged. But if you invite someone else into that conversation, it's no longer privileged. But the ethical rules were clarified to explain that in these situations, that is no longer true. So one of the comments says the client may wish to have family members or other persons participate in discussions with the lawyer. When necessary to assist in the representation, the presence of these persons furthers the rendition of legal services to the client and does not waive the attorney-client privilege. So these clarification of the ethical rules has been really great to help make sure that attorneys aren't becoming involved or feeling required to, infringe on their own clients' rights in order to continue to represent them. Next slide, please. So SDM is a great tool, but it's not appropriate in every single situation in all of the time. So in order to use SDM, the decision maker, the person with a disability who wants to utilize SDM, they have to have enough capacity to understand the agreement itself and the effects of the agreement. They have to enter that agreement without any coercion or undue influence. If there is coercion or undue influence, the agreement is not valid. They also have to have some capacity to advocate for themselves. As far as outside of the decision maker, they have to have a trusted supporter. so supportive decision making doesn't work if your supporters are not trustworthy. So they need to have people in their lives that they trust and they're willing to go to discuss their issues or concerns or whatever they're seeking support in. STM is most beneficial where a client is going to either increase or maintain their current capacity. So in situations where someone is having decline of capacity, for instance, Alzheimer's, STM is likely not going to be the best or the most long-term solution. Next slide, please. So when we're talking about using STM as an alternative to guardianship, you know, you don't want to skip directly to guardianship because, like I said earlier, our statutes require that, you know, less restrictive alternatives are explored first. So if someone's coming in saying, hey, we think we need a guardianship, our the first thing we do is say, are you sure you need a guardianship? Let's talk about why you think you need a guardianship. So you would want to discuss with your client, with that person and their family, the reasons why that they think they need a guardianship. You want to explain to them about any less restrictive alternatives that are available and how they might work. And you also want to explain to them what it's like to try to have your rights restored and have the guardianship dissolved. Many families don't understand that it can be very difficult and very expensive to end a guardianship, and they think they can just get it for a year or two while, you know, a person, you know, regains capacity and then they'll just dissolve it, no big deal, but it can be quite a lengthy, difficult process, and again, expensive. So you want to discuss all those aspects as you're talking to someone about guardianship or the alternatives. Next slide, please. So in an STM agreement, you know, Olivia explained all the many states that have statutes about STM, and they're all pretty different, but there are some basic elements that are the same. So an STM agreement is a written document, and like Olivia said, we use STM all the time when we're making our own day-to-day decisions. You know, deciding whether the houses that we want to buy is the right choice, whether that car repair is a good idea. But you want to have it in writing when you're a person who might be at risk of having your rights removed. That written document can help others feel more comfortable that you do have a support system in place. And that written document also can be used when, you know, like at the bank or the doctor's office to explain why you have this person with you, why they're discussing all of your personal details. The STM agreement has to specifically designate the supporters, has to list them by name. And it's not required, but you also typically want to designate an alternate supporter. So if something happens to your supporter, if they are no longer able to be your supporter, if they move out of the country and they're not available to you anymore, you want to have kind of someone in the wings ready to step in. And then in your agreement, you're going to include that basic information for the decision maker and supporter, their name, their phone number, in case people need to reach them. Next slide, please. Okay, so additional elements. In the STM agreement, it needs to list out how the supporters will help, how they will help the decision maker. So you can have some or all of these options. The supporter might help with collecting and gathering information. The supporter might help with exploring your options. You know, also explaining the risks and benefits of each option, the pros and cons. They can give guidance, they can make recommendations, they can say, this is what I would do. And then they can help the decision maker carry out the decision. So for instance, they might be deciding to open up a savings account, and they've decided to open that account, and the supporter cannot do that on their behalf because it's not substitute decision making, but that supporter can go to the bank with them and help explain what kind of account they want, and help make sure that that account is opened. Next slide, please. So additional elements of the STM agreement. Again, you're going to want to be specific about the areas or the domains where the supporter is assisting the decision maker. So most commonly, the domains that we see included in STM agreements are either medical, mental health, relationships, living arrangements, voting, finances, benefits, contracts, those sorts of things, employment, and then travel. You can add additional things to your SDM agreement. They're highly customizable. You can make it work for yourself. You can choose some or all of these, and you can also have multiple supporters and designate different supporters for different domains. So if my dad is a nurse, I might want him to be my supporter for medical decision making, but say my mom is an accountant, so I want her help with my finances and benefits. So you can pick and choose and tailor your agreement to your personal situation. Next slide, please. So again, our new SDM statute, the law did pass. We're waiting for it to be signed by the governor. Hoping that will happen soon. And as of July 1st, all SDM agreements are going to be required to be notarized. So the document is going to have to be signed by the decision maker. It's going to have to be signed by all of the supporters who are designated, including any alternate supporters. And then that document is going to need to be notarized. And in Florida, notarization requires 2 witness signatures. And those witnesses can't be the decision maker or the supporters. They have to be 2 uninvolved individuals. Next slide, please. So on this slide, we have an image of a sample SDM agreement. This is just to show like what they can look like. It does not have to look exactly like this. But on this document, you will see the elements I was just discussing, where you put in the decision maker's name and information, date of birth, contact information. You see a section where they can designate the types of decisions they want help with, health care, financial. You see another section where it explains how you want your supporters to help you. So is that giving information? Is it discussing pros and cons? Is it communicating my decisions, or some combination of those? And then you see another section where you're listing out the supporters and their contact information and specifying for each supporter, these are the areas I want their help with. Next slide, please. So this is a second sample SDM agreement. This is one using pictures. And I like to show individuals this, especially lawyers who get concerned about whether they're able to execute these agreements with their clients. The fact that this document uses pictures to help the decision maker understand what they are deciding and what they are signing does not make it invalid. Many people learn better visually. It does not mean that you don't understand things. It does not mean you cannot make decisions. So if someone learns better visually, understands things better visually, an SDM agreement like this one that has pictures to explain what they're choosing is perfectly valid and appropriate. Next slide, please. Okay, so I just wanted to have a little conversation about how SDM can be used in conjunction with guardianship. It doesn't have to be one or the other. It doesn't have to be a binary. And SDM can be, a support along with guardianship. So if someone is already in a guardianship, there are various statutes and rules that require their guardian to advocate and help them try to regain their capacity and regain their rights. So I've listed a couple of statutes here. 744.361 specifies that the guardians have a duty to assist the individual with developing or regaining capacity. And 744.3675 requires the annual plan that has to be filed in every guardianship every year, that plan has to include information on what activities, what things that the guardian did to enhance capacity and to help with restoration of rights. So when someone is in a guardianship, SDM can be a great tool for the guardian to use to fulfill the requirements of these 2 statutes. Using SDM, again, in the benefits Olivia listed earlier, it can help people learn how to make decisions through practice. So even if, say, your right to make healthcare decisions has been removed, the guardian could still engage in supported decision-making with that person to allow them to practice making healthcare decisions. You know, as long as that guardianship is in place, ultimately the guardian has the decision-making authority. But by using SDM with the guardianship, they can allow the person to practice making decisions, and then they can kind of evaluate how they're making those decisions. And then they'll be able to use that as evidence to the court to show, look, I've helped them try to regain capacity, and hopefully eventually get to the point where they can say, court, please reinstate their right to make their own healthcare decisions, because look, they've been doing it with SDM and they are capable. And this can be used to work towards a partial restoration, you know, 1 or 2 rights that you think that they're going to be able to get to the point of exercising, or it can lead to a complete restoration of rights. And we have an example of that later on in the presentation. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm going to turn it back over to Olivia for some example client scenarios. I may pipe in if I can't help myself, but I'll turn it over to you, Olivia.
Great. So we're kind of making this a little interactive, just to kind of give some examples and put into practice the information that we've just been discussing. So in scenario 1 here, we have a disabled student who is eligible to remain in school until age 22. Their parent has been told they need a guardianship to remain involved in their child's education. So is this a scenario where they do need a guardianship, or would an alternative be a better option? And so just to kind of get people's thoughts, we'll let John and Steph kind of chime in. But what do you think would be, just given that limited information? I know it's a little blurb, but is this a situation where guardianship is needed, or might a lesser alternative be more appropriate? Anybody have thoughts?
Steph, you want to take this one? You want me to pipe in? All right. So for me, I'll go ahead and pipe in. This is John Finch. It's interesting on the first one, right? So you have a student, 22 years old. The parents been told the guardianship to remain involved in their child's education, right? And so that's been historically been a big issue that's not true, right? And so this is a great example of supported decision making and kind of changing that historical culture inside of education to let, 18, you're considered an adult to have family help them, but necessarily require a guardianship.
Yeah. So obviously we have limited information here. So you may have a student where that is completely appropriate. But one of the things with guardianship is that we are to assume capacity. So a lot of times we kind of seen this happening in reverse, where incapacity is assumed, and we're kind of making the student prove that they have capacity. That's not how this is intended to work. Capacity is supposed to be assumed unless, proven otherwise. So in this case, obviously, if someone's turning 18, we don't want to immediately terminate their rights. They haven't had the time or ability really to make any life decisions. So in this case, then supported decision-making agreement, or maybe a power of attorney. We also refer to them as FERPA releases in this instance might be appropriate as well. But there isn't necessarily the need to start immediately out of the gate with a guardianship. And in this instance, SDM would probably be a little more appropriate. All right.
Can I pipe in and say one thing?
Of course.
Sorry, I obviously cannot help myself. This is Caitlin again, and I just wanted to say this scenario shouldn't be happening anymore. It probably shouldn't have been happening in the first place, but a bill was passed a couple years ago requiring school districts to inform parents and students about a range of options, not just guardianship, but also guardian advocacy, powers of attorney, and those FERPA releases. which is a federal release of education records that Olivia mentioned. And with the SDM bill that just passed, once it's signed by the governor, SDM will be in that list, and schools should be required to also inform students and their parents about SDM as well.
All right. Scenario number 2. We have a disabled teen in foster care who will be aging out soon. They have supportive adults in their life, just none who are able to take custody of them once they age out. So what are your thoughts on this situation? Is this a situation where supported decision-making might be appropriate?
Yes, this is Steph. Sorry, I couldn't chime in earlier. I was having trouble unmuting myself. But yes, I think an SDM would be appropriate in this scenario, since they have that network already that can help, it looks like, with some aspects in life. So like you said, it can be very customized. So I think
And, oftentimes, again, we're seeing people who are aging out of foster care immediately being funneled into guardianships, placed in group homes, which may or may not be the appropriate setting for them. So in this scenario, it's saying that they have supported adults, but no one that's able to take custody. Why are we assuming that they need someone to take custody of them? They may just need one of those supportive adults to help them figure out their living arrangements and where they're going to live after they age out. But it's not necessarily that they need someone to house them or to make those decisions. So absolutely, this is an instance where we do see guardianships overutilized, and where supported decision-making may be a much better alternative. Kayla, anything you want to add before we jump to the next slide?
Sure, why not? I worked with a lot of teens and young people in foster care for several years before going to law school, and there was a bill passed that allowed the Department of Children and Families to seek guardianship at age 17 and a half, so that it would already be in place the day they turned 18. And that was a very well-intentioned law based on some young disabled people who were victimized after after exiting foster care. But it's kind of had an adverse effect on the young disabled individuals who do have capacity and can make decisions, because a lot of the folks in the system will assume that they can't take care of themselves because, like Olivia was expressing earlier, they've never been given the chance to show that they can.
Right, next slide. All right. So we have, in this first scenario, the child of an older adult is concerned about their aging parent. The parent has not had any major issues yet, but their child believes that they may be vulnerable to manipulation due to their age. Is this a scenario where supported decision-making may be appropriate?
I think back to, I think it was Caitlin's comment, that it's expected that their capacity will increase over time. And you gave the example of like Alzheimer's, that in those situations, maybe SDM would not be appropriate. But if they're not having any issues yet, you don't want to jump the gun, I guess. But yeah, this one's a little tricky because they are.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, that's it.
So this was one of the discussions that we frequently had with other stakeholders when we were working on the supported decision-making bill, particularly, organizations like AARP, where we wanted to make sure that this was going to be something that could be utilized by older adults as well as younger adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So you're absolutely correct that if this person is not experiencing any issues yet, and we're just saying, grandma's 80 now, and so maybe we need to put grandma under guardianship just because she's 80. And that's not necessarily appropriate. So this is an instance where maybe supported decision making could be used to keep someone out of a guardianship that is unnecessary at this stage. And you know, they have that document to show that they do have supporters helping them make those decisions. You know, and as they do lose capacity as they age, or if they have a condition like Alzheimer's, you know, then we can, you know, put in place things like pre-need guardianships, which I will let Caitlin talk a little bit about. Power of attorney sometimes is more appropriate as someone has diminished capacity, but they're still able to make some of their own decisions. So yeah, the SDM could be used in this scenario if they're not experiencing any issues or concerns yet. So Caitlin, go ahead.
Yeah, so what Olivia was getting at there with the pre-need guardian and power of attorney, as a lawyer in this scenario, I might recommend kind of a suite of options, and they can cascade into place when appropriate. So you can start out with an SDM agreement, and use that for as long as it's appropriate and as long as it's working. If this older parent, this aging adult does begin to experience dementia and gets to the point where they are no longer able to use that SDM agreement effectively, you can already have executed a healthcare surrogate form, a power of attorney, or designated a pre-need guardian, or a combination of all of those. So what those documents allow is, you know, as that parent ages, if again, they get to the point where SDM is no longer working, they already have a document in place designating a power of attorney. I want this specific person to make my decisions for me. And ideally, they will have discussed the decisions they would prefer with that person ahead of time. Same with healthcare surrogate. They can designate the person they feel most comfortable with to make healthcare decisions when they reach the point that they're no longer able to make them for themselves. And that still really emphasizes autonomy and, you know, self-determination, because they are choosing the person who's going to make those decisions when they get to the point that they cannot. And then designating a pre-need guardian is just what it sounds like. You can, you know, execute a document that says, in the event I need a guardianship, I want this person to be my guardian. And you can choose for yourself who you want to be that decision maker on your behalf, should you get to the point where you need that. And I really like kind of a package deal where you have all of these in place. You get all of these in place while the person has full capacity, while they're able to discuss everything and really enunciate their preferences, and it's all there and ready and waiting should it become necessary.
Next scenario. So we have a disabled adult is encountering health issues and is having difficulty understanding their healthcare needs and options. So again, is this a scenario where supported decision-making might be an appropriate mechanism?
Olivia, I would even take this out as just any adult, right? As I have aged, I depending on the doctor, sometimes they're telling me and using words that I don't even understand what's going on. And so very much so, I can see you could have a team of individuals to help kind of explain that. But it also reminded me of the example of using pictures to kind of help explain maybe a surgery or a process. You know, I think I recently had knee surgery, and, you know, I was fortunate in YouTube and watched a bunch of videos of what was to be expected. But, you know, having individuals, having that assistance to navigate somebody on what that is and the pros and cons, I think anybody could use that, but especially as it comes to supported decision making, I could see that being very helpful.
Yeah, and in this situation, you know, we're just saying they're having difficulty understanding. Not that they can't make those decisions, they're having difficulty understanding the information. And that is one of the roles of the supporter, is to help them understand that information and kind of break it down into terms that they can understand. So they understand what their options are and how to best meet their own needs. But absolutely, especially when we're just talking about specific to healthcare, this is probably an area where supported decision making may fit, or if they need additional assistance with making those decisions, you know, maybe a healthcare surrogacy or power of attorney, just related to healthcare. But supported decision-making definitely can be utilized to help them understand those decisions. Anything else, Caitlin, you want to add before we move on?
That was great, and I like John's example with the videos. That's exactly what I would do.
All right, next slide. So we talked a little bit earlier about the first SDM case in Florida in 2016. So this is Michael Lincoln McCrate. He was a young man that was placed under guardianship as he was aging out of foster care. He went from foster care to a group home for disabled adults. He wanted to live independently, but felt he was not listened to or supported in his goals. And he was able to devise a plan to get access to a phone and call an advocacy organization actually called Disability Rights Florida for assistance, because the group home is limiting his access to phone, to his money, and to his friends and family. So someone had filed a petition for guardianship. Mike himself doesn't know who or why, but he is a great self-advocate. He actually told his guardian that he needed money to buy a video game that he wanted to play. He actually used that money to then purchase a burner cell phone in order to call Disability Rights Florida for assistance in terminating his guardianship. So the planning stage there, and the fact that he was able to kind of devise this plan is kind of a pretty good indicator that maybe this is a person that doesn't need at least a full guardianship. And he was able to work with Disability Rights Florida. We were able to get his guardianship terminated. He has a supported decision-making agreement in place, and Mike has done great. He got his driver's license so he can drive. He lives independently in his own apartment. He works full-time. He has friends, and when he was under guardianship, one of the things that he shares about that is that he felt very isolated. So he was actually cut off from some of his family and friends that the guardian wouldn't allow to have contact with him. He wasn't allowed to attend church on Sundays, to have, kind of that social aspect of his life. He wasn't able to volunteer or to work. So he was pretty miserable under that guardianship, and felt that the guardian wasn't listening to him or what he wanted for himself. So Mike is our Florida's version of Jenny Hatch. So he really kicked this off. He's been a great self-advocate, and it's really because of the work of a lot of our self-advocates, Mike being one of them, that really pushed for supported decision-making, reached out to their state reps and state senators, and really helped us kind of get the bill unstuck. So as much of a role as Disability Rights Florida played in advocating for that, it was really the self-advocates that managed to push this bill across the finish line, to get it passed with unanimous support. We didn't have a single vote in opposition to the bill in all of its committees. When it hit the floor in both chambers, it was voted out unanimously, and it really is because of Mike and other self-advocates that were advocating for their rights and wanting to make their own decisions. So Mike is kind of our champion of SDM here in Florida. And I think, just an important person for people to be familiar with, as we're talking about supported decision-making in Florida. So Caitlin, I don't know if there's anything else you want to add about Mike.
He's an example, I think, of one of those kids who was coming out of foster care, and I believe it was the foster care system that sought the guardianship for him. And he was at no point in his life had he ever been able to decide who he was going to hang out with, where he was going to live, because he'd been in foster care all that time and then went straight to a group home. Sorry, I'm speaking quickly. But I think when I think about Mike, he is a young man with a disability. He does have an intellectual disability, and the thing that Mike, I think, really illustrates, aside from the incredible impact that self-advocates can have, is the concept of the real question at the heart of guardianship, which is whether someone can make decisions. We don't expect people to make perfect decisions. We don't expect people to always make the exact right decision. we don't expect people to always make very quick decisions. You know, Mike is a person who might need a little bit more time to understand his options, and so the supporter is very helpful in helping give additional explanation about, you know, maybe a medical procedure or his budget or something like that. But he is able to make decisions. You know, he was able to decide, well, I don't want to live in this group home. You know, he is a decision maker. And just he makes decisions a little bit differently. And but you know, his situation that is maybe a little different than what people expect is just as, you know, valid as any other. And he's, you know, I think that having SDM and being able to have his rights restored and getting employment and a car and, you know, having his friends and hanging out, like all these positive impacts we talked about, we've seen in Mike over the years with self-esteem and, you know, just really putting himself out there more, trying new different things. And I mean, this is exactly the heart of the concept is we don't expect perfection. We don't expect you to, you know, bing, bang, boom, know exactly what to do. The moment an option presents itself, you know, it's okay to be deliberate and it's okay to take time and make the decision carefully.
And one of the things, you know, we talk about, particularly in the disability community, in regard to like personal autonomy and decisions, is dignity of risk. And that is what Mike was really being denied. As Caitlin said, making bad decisions does not equate to an inability to make decisions. If that were the case, then everybody would be under a guardianship because we've all made poor decisions somewhere along the way in our lives. And, you know, that's how we learn oftentimes. So if you have, say, a young adult going to college without a disability and they have an overdraft fee on their bank account because they spent too much money, we're not going to immediately place that young person under a guardianship. That's just considered being young and making poor financial decisions. And they have to deal with the consequences of that, and they learn not to do that anymore. So oftentimes we hold people with disabilities to a much higher standard. So people with disabilities, particularly when we're talking about intellectual and developmental disabilities, and even seniors, you know, if they bounce a check or, you know, overdraft or make some, you know, poor decision, it's kind of this immediate jump to, well, they need a guardian. Well, no, not necessarily. They didn't do anything that, you know, everybody else hasn't done at some point in their life. So it really is about providing them with those learning opportunities and giving them the opportunity to fail. You know, 99% of success is failure. And so if we are denying people the opportunity to fail and to make poor decisions, we're also denying them the opportunity to learn from those decisions, to improve their decision-making skills. And so that's where we've seen, you know, what Mike was trapped in. For the most part, he's made some decent decisions, but he has made some poor decisions and he, you know, faces the consequences for that. But he learns from that. And even in the time that I've known Mike, you know, we've seen him grow as a person and because he is able to control his own life. So I think, you know, Mike is a great example. You know, he's kind of our role model for SDM and who we hold out. But hopefully with the statute that just passed, the governor will sign it. Once it's implemented, hopefully we will see a lot more scenarios like Mike. So I think that's everything that we had. So we can open it up for questions.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation, and congratulations to you, your team, everybody that was involved in making this a reality. It's really a game changer for the community, and Mike's story is so incredible and inspiring. So that was such a wonderful presentation. We do want to answer a few questions that came up during the PowerPoint. The first one being, where can an individual go if they wanted to obtain a supported decision-making agreement? Is there some sort of template that they can download?
Yes, on Disability Rights Florida's website, we have a couple templates that are available. I know that other organizations also have templates, like the ACLU has a template. So it's something you can readily find online. And they are generally something that you can do yourself. You're not required to have an attorney or anything like that. But also if folks prefer and it is helpful to them, Disability Rights Florida will assist people in creating their own SDM agreement. So they can call our hotline, contact our intake department, and we will gladly assist them to develop one.
That's wonderful. And I wanted to share too that ABLE accounts are really a good tool and in line with this whole theme of supported decision making, since the beneficiary, the individual with the disability, is the owner of the ABLE account. However, another person can help and maintain and open the account for them, and that individual really has the power to select who can serve in that role to be its legal representative. So, Caitlin and Olivia, can you guys think of any other tools or resources that are in line with supported decision-making, like ABLE accounts?
Sure. I mean, I think one of the great tools, and the Florida Developmental Disability Council has it on their website. They actually have like an entire course you can take. I think it's called Lighting the Way, Lighting the Path. I had it on the tip of my tongue and I just drew a blank on what they call it. But in those materials, there's kind of a checklist that people can walk through to kind of assess their decision-making abilities and areas where they may need some additional help, to really determine if supported decision-making is something that would be appropriate for them, or, you know, if it needs to be used in conjunction with another tool as well. So that's a great source. There's several of those checklists I know that float around online. But I think that the Florida Developmental Disability Council website has probably the best one for Florida. And then I'll toss it over to Caitlin for any other resources.
Yeah, so I did look it up. It's Lighting the Way to Guardianship. It's the Developmental Disability Council project. And their resource is great. You can go through different domains and see which areas supported decision making will work for you. And it can help you decide, you know, like I was talking about, the kind of package deal of different documents. You know, perhaps you say, I would like to use supported decision making in my relationships and educational decisions, but you know, I don't want to deal with budgeting. I don't want to deal with finances. So I'll do a power of attorney and let, you know, someone else do those things for me. So I think, you know, tools and resources in conjunction would be the legal documents I discussed, the healthcare surrogate form, the pre-need guardian, and the power of attorney. And all of those documents you can get for free. You can download them from the Florida Courts online website. And I believe that's floridacourts.org. But they have templates that are, it contain all the required elements under Florida law. So you can know that if you execute that template, it's going to meet the requirements of Florida law.
Perfect. Well, that's all the time we have for questions. If we didn't get to your question specifically, we'll be working over the next few days to get back to everyone. Please remember that all of our sessions are recorded and they'll be posted on our YouTube channel in the next week or so. We'll take one last break before I pass it on to John and Sam to conclude today's AbleCon event. Thank you again, Caitlin and Olivia, and we'll see you guys soon.
Thank you.